I just got done doing about an hour and 45 minutes live video explaining my analysis, my thoughts on the Chauvin verdict. And for some reason, the internet connection was awful and I wasn't happy with it. And the microphone actually didn't even work. So I wanted to just do, until I get over the technical difficulties, just a regular upload video, just real quick, repeating my thoughts as far as my take on the Chauvin verdict. And here is my take that there's a misconception of what he was convicted of. Two of the charges had the word murder in them. But what's important to understand is that I think it's perfectly possible that a jury found that there were all the elements met of each of these three counts against him, because none of them required any specific intent for Derek Chauvin to kill George Floyd. They were all basically manslaughter type charges, even though two of them had the words murder in their names. And specifically, the counts were this: count one, murder in the second degree. All that took was that George Floyd died, that the defendant caused that death, and that at the time that that death was caused, that George Floyd was committing or attempting to commit some felony offense, which in this case they said was basically assault in the third degree or using excessive force. So they didn't really have to prove what we would have thought as murder. The second charge, count two, and these are all separate, independent counts with different elements. That's why they could charge them all and they can sentence them all. Count two is murder in the third degree. So they have to prove that George Floyd died, that the defendant caused his death, and that it was caused by an intentional act that was imminently dangerous, which means basically doing something reckless that could cause somebody's death. Again, no requirement that he intended anyone to die specifically, much less George Floyd. Not your usual murder, but these are state laws, Minnesota law. Count three. Now this is the manslaughter charge. This is basically culpable negligence, doing something that is reckless, with a chance to cause death or great bodily harm to another person. That in fact happens. And that's probably what we all would have thought would actually be charged here, rather than the first two charges as well. So neither one of these three charges required the jury to find that Derek Chauvin intended George Floyd to die. So a jury, any reasonable jury, could have seen that there was enough evidence to prove that here if they believed that beyond any reasonable doubt it was the airway constriction that killed him. I don't doubt that a jury could find that. There appears to have been a lot of evidence that took place, and then coupled with the video, and then the fact that he didn't testify and give his own side of the story, I can see a jury convicting him of all of those under the circumstances. The problem is when you have the president of the free world praying for a guilty verdict against you, and Maxine Waters trying to threaten the jurors and create riots just in case they want to acquit you, combined with the fact that the whole racism thing completely hijacked that case. I think the real shame is that we don't really know for sure that is what the jury wanted to do, because they really didn't have any other choice unless they wanted to take their own lives into their hands and the lives of their families. So what did the jury not find? There was no element in their jury instructions about racism, whether systematic racism or racism on behalf of Derek Chauvin. There was no finding of racism. There was no evidence that racism had anything to do with the death of George Floyd. And that is the real shame here. So there were a couple studies that I found that I went over. One is a new survey that was commissioned by the Skeptic Research Center, some polling data, which is really, really interesting. The public is really misinformed on the issue of police violence, particularly in regards to black victims. So participants across this political spectrum were surveyed and defined themselves as conservative politically or as liberal politically. Now, this is crazy. Most notably, the majority of respondents in each category believed that police killed unarmed black men at an exponentially higher rate than reality. Over 80% of liberals guessed that it was at least 100 unarmed black men killed each year, compared to 66% of moderates and 54% of conservatives who thought the same thing. But according to a close database compiled by Mapping Police Violence, the actual number of black men killed by the police in the year 2019 was only 27. Not hundreds, not thousands. The second question the survey asked in this polling data was, in 2019, what percentage of people killed by police were black? While the survey states that the actual percentage is around 25%, the average respondent guessed it was 50%. Liberals said 58%. Conservatives said 41%. Both much higher than reality. So there's this disconnect between perception and reality. I wonder why. Meanwhile, left unsaid is the fact that unarmed white people were killed by cops in highly questionable circumstances while reaching for their license during a traffic stop, or failing to raise their hands when ordered to, or lying face down on the ground and being suffocated to death by wildly excessive force by police. And all of that is ignored by the media. And consequently, the public likely perceives this problem to be almost non-existent, when, in my experience of practicing primarily in the area of police misconduct, and including especially excessive force for the past 15 years, it's almost all been involving white people. And the problem actually, the media won't tell you about it and the politicians won't tell you about it, that exists. And it's actually more people who were shot to death by the police who are white than who are black. There was a doctoral candidate, Zach Goldberg, who did some research that showed that unarmed black victims of fatal police shootings generate staggeringly 9 times as many news search results as compared to white victims. Meanwhile, politicians continue to exploit this. For instance, Kamala Harris, in a campaign ad last fall, said, "Why in this nation do black Americans wake up knowing they could lose their life in the course of just living their life?" LeBron James tweeted, "We're literally hunted every day, every time we step foot outside the comfort of our homes." And then there was the 1,300 public health officials who wrote a letter last year in support of nationwide BLM protests, claiming, quote, "White supremacy is a lethal public health issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19. So despite advocating for draconian lockdown measures, public health experts stated, quote, "We do not condemn these gatherings as risky for COVID-19 transmission. We support them as vital to the national public health." There was another article that just came out April 14th of 2021 from Dan O'Donnell, and I believe that this was from the McIver Institute. It said, it talks about the fact that the Washington Post has a database which you can access of every known deadly police shooting in America since 2015. So you can look up the numbers for yourself. So as of April 14th, there were 6,211 people who were shot and killed by law enforcement officers. 46% of those, which was 2,883 to be exact, were white people, while only 24%, or 1,496 people, were black. So one of the most pernicious myths about police shootings, the article wrote, is that officers shoot unarmed black men at an alarming rate, when in fact just 2% of the people who were killed by a police officer were unarmed and black. Since the beginning of 2015, law enforcement officers across the country have actually killed 33 more unarmed white people than unarmed black people. So the counter argument to that is, well, blacks are only 13% of the population, and whites are 76.3% of the population, and black people are statistically, therefore, more likely to be shot and killed by law enforcement officers than white people. Well, multiple scientific studies have proven that racial animus is not a factor in that disparity. National Academy of Sciences 2019 found no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by police, and determined that race-specific county-level violent crime strongly predicts the race of the civilian shot. In other words, it's the violent crime rate of a given race, not race itself, that determines the likelihood of a member of that race being shot and killed by law enforcement. So although, yes, blacks comprise just 13% of the U.S. population, they account for 53% of the murder and non-negligent manslaughter arrests of 2018, which is the most recent year for FBI crime data. 54% of all robbery arrests and 37% of all violent crime arrests. Whites, on the other hand, comprise 76% of the population, but made up just 44% of the murder and non-negligent manslaughter, 43% of the robbery, and 59% of the total violent crime arrests. In Milwaukee, for instance, there were 890 total murders in the city since 2015. A staggering 79% of the victims were black. In 2021, that percentage has jumped to 91%, as 31 of the 34 people killed in Milwaukee as of April 14th of 2021 were black. So the fact is that statistically, blacks are far more likely to be victims of homicide or other violent crimes, and also statistically more likely to commit violent crimes that would bring them into conflict with law enforcement. This, not racism, according to the statistics, is the reason for the disparity in police shootings. So, since 2015, law enforcement officers have shot and killed 168 unarmed white people, 135 unarmed black people, and just 74 unarmed Hispanic people. So, are police officers also racist against Hispanics or less racist against Hispanics? Or is it that while Hispanics account for 17% of the total U.S. population, they represent 21% of the murder arrests and 25% of the total violent crime arrests? Statistics that are more in line with the representation in the general population. 2015, the Obama Justice Department studied the Philadelphia Department's use of force incidents and determined that white police officers were less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than were black or Hispanic police officers. Harvard University economist Roland Fryer concluded that, quote, I didn't find racial differences in officer-involved shootings after studying 1,399 of them in California, Texas, Colorado, and Washington from 2000 to 2015. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that 61.5 million people in a given year have contact with law enforcement, and that they make over 10 million arrests per year. And yet we're only really talking about, in 2019, 27 unarmed black people that were shot. And out of all shot, the overwhelming majority were armed with either a gun or a knife, some of them with a car, and not just blacks, but of all colors. So it's a pretty small number statistically of people who were actually shot and killed by the police every year. So there's no evidence for a systematic racism or implied racism as a basis for any of the stuff that happens. They would have to find some way to prove that Derek Chauvin himself did this because of the guy's skin color. And I didn't see anything on the jury instructions or anything that came out at the trial, and you would have, that really had anything to do with any bias by Derek Chauvin. And the problem with this is that the entire real issue of police reform and of constitutional liberty and rights, and whether or not we want to live in a country where there are over 10 million arrests per year, and where there are 5,000 plus federal criminal statutes and thousands more in each individual state. Instead, we're talking about really a non-issue. It's a very, very small number of bad incidents, whereas we ignore other incidents, some of which are worse, if they don't have victims of the right skin color. And that's just completely wrong. And so here's the problem with the Chauvin verdict. It's not that there wasn't enough evidence. It's that you had improper pressures being placed on the jury. The jurors were not sequestered by the judge. The trial wasn't moved from such a hostile location. There should be things put in place so that any defendant gets protections. I mean, what did we learn from To Kill a Mockingbird? That yes, the system's not perfect, but we still go through the process and we do our best to give every defendant a fair trial, even if the public is hostile to that person, even for racism issues. And that's sort of what we have in the reverse here. Because of Derek Chauvin's skin color, it doesn't matter whether he's actually guilty. It's just mob justice. And that's the danger here because, did the jury voluntarily find him guilty beyond any reasonable doubt of these three charges? We don't really know because there was all this pressure and these threats against them. I mean, what would have happened to these jurors had they acquitted him? There were, the New York Times was doxing them and threatening to dox them individually. There was a defense witness who testified on behalf of Derek Chauvin who had pig's blood sprayed on his house, or what they thought was his house. We had riots about to start. We had Maxine Waters trying to sway the jury and bias the defendant here. We had the President of the United States praying for a guilty verdict. None of these are things that we should be celebrating as preserving the integrity of our judicial system, just because they don't like Derek Chauvin. And not that he should be liked. You should like the judicial system and the protections which our founding fathers put in place. In reality, we'll never know unless there's another trial. And what does that mean? Ironically, whereas they could have just had a regular fair trial and easily convicted him based on the evidence that they had, whereas now they've given him the opportunity to appeal. And if you have judges who are willing to do the right thing, I mean, everybody knows this wasn't a fair trial. It turned into a show trial. And, as Dershowitz pointed out, that's like what the KKK did in the 1920s and 1930s, is they would intimidate outside the courthouse when there was a black defendant. And that's pretty much what's happening here in reverse. And it's not right, being used against any ethnicity or any minority or any skin color. Justice should be equal for all. Justice should be colorblind. Justice should be blind, period. And that is the real story and the real tragedy of this case. I don't think anybody was surprised in the outcome. But the real surprise, or the real shame is that, we never really will know. And ironically, that may be what frees Derek Chauvin, or at least sets him up for a new trial. So those are my thoughts on that, and I'm sorry the live feed screwed up, but those were the main points that I went through, and hopefully I can get the technical difficulties straightened out. I mean, the other thing was, I guess, is if, just particular to Joe Biden, I mean, if you take a look at the video of the pre-prepared speech, obviously, that he gave after the verdict, and then take a look at that, and then compare it to what he said back in 2014. Remember, he was vice president of the United States for 8 years, and then he's been in Washington, D.C., helping to run the government for, since, the 60s, or 60s or 70s. So for, since the civil rights era, I mean, he has been a part of the system, which he now says is systematically racist.
Today, a jury in Minnesota found former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin guilty on all counts in the murder of George Floyd last May. It was a murder in the full light of day, and it ripped the blinders off for the whole world to see the systemic racism the Vice President just referred to. The systemic racism is a stain on our nation's soul. The knee on the neck of justice for Black Americans. Profound fear and trauma, the pain, the exhaustion that Black and brown Americans experience every single day.
Okay, so cops are bad, right? Cops are systematically racist. They're individually racist. Cops are bad and biased towards Black and brown people. Cops are really just evil. This is Joe Biden as president in 2021. But take a look at what he said in 2014, actually May 12th of 2014.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the White House. I especially want to welcome my old friend Tommy Nee and Bill Johnson and everyone in the National Association of Police Organization. And ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying congratulations to all of you assembled behind us. It's a genuine honor to be in the presence of the best of the best. Each year, you guys come down here, and Tommy, you bring down the best, and you're an inspiration. You're not only an inspiration to us, but you're an inspiration to all your fellow law enforcement colleagues all across the entire country. And the President and I, we recognize the bravery that you display simply by putting on that shield every morning. That all by itself is an act of bravery. Strapping on your sidearm, kissing your husband or your wife goodbye at the door, walking out knowing, because most of you are experienced, knowing that you don't know with any degree of certitude what's about to greet you. You have no idea, except some of it may not be good.
And it goes on and on. But that's not all. Look what his buddy Obama had to say just after him.
And let me start by thanking Joe Biden, not only for being a great vice president, which he is, but also being a lifelong friend of law enforcement. Now, he and I have a special reason for loving law enforcement, because we have the unusual privilege of being surrounded by law enforcement every minute of every day. And they also protect the people we love most in the world, our families. So we're incredibly grateful to them.
Wait a minute, now I'm confused. So are police officers systematically racist and evil? We have this problem with them going after black and brown people, but hey, there you have it from Obama right there, that Joe Biden was vice president for 8 years, and he was a great friend to law enforcement. And there is a black person right there, Barack Obama, stating that cops are so great that they protect his black family. So you know you know that this is all just politics, and the sad reality is that these race pimps, these race baiters, are exploiting black people. They're exploiting actual racism that does exist, and they're trying to impute it on all police officers when that really, there's no basis for that. That's not the actual problem. There does need to be reform of our criminal justice system and the place that we found ourselves now. But I think I got everything out that was of importance anyways, out of that hour and 45 minutes that just I got screwed on. So anyways, I'll check out my live videos usually Monday and Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Please join me. We have a great chat, and we have other things in the works as far as videos like this and new updates on new cases. So please make sure that you subscribe at thecivilrightslawyer.com to email updates, spam free. Follow us on Facebook. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube as well.